This morning I'll preach a second in the sermon series entitled Love Matters. And I'm basing these reflections on the work of a gentleman by the name of Norman Wordsbach, who is a professor of theology at Duke Divinity School. And he wrote this wonderful, wonderful book entitled The Way of Love. And I found the chapter that he wrote on love and creation to be one of the clearest and most thoughtful and engaging passages that I have read in quite a long time. So I'd like to share with you some of his insights as we worship this morning. And with his guidance, we'll wander through the primordial Garden of Eden. We'll consider a very insightful theological notion, and then finish up with a couple of wonderful stories that illustrate all that we are considering this morning. When the ancient scribes of Israel wanted to define for us what life was really all about, they adopt the image of a garden. Now, gardens are beautiful things, but they're things that we engage in and that we care for. Gardens don't just magically happen all on their own. They are the product of both divine promise and providence and the product of human effort and endeavor. And how we see the world, I think, makes a very, very big difference. If we go around believing that it is a garden, we know that we have the opportunity to both receive and to restore, to be blessed by the good things, and to do our part in nurturing and caring that the good things that gardens bear will be available to others. Sometimes I think we go through life thinking of the world as a discount department store where we just sort of get what we want for as little effort as possible. And that's not a very good thing. But when the ancient scribes want to tell us what is the basic nature of the life that we have been given by God, their overwhelming metaphor is that of a garden, a place that is both a gift and an opportunity to be about good and important things. There's a couple of things from the story that I'd like to lift up this morning. The first is that God, as the creator, is in the garden, is a part of the garden, is intimately present in the garden. That God is not a distant creator who creates the world from some far away place, snapping magical fingers, but God is there. God walks through the garden. God plants the plants. God tills the soil. That there is an intimacy between the Creator and each and every creature that God makes. A second thing that's worth noting is the word Eden, the Garden of Eden. The word Eden literally means delight. God's act of creation is an expression of God's love and God's delight and God's joy. You see, there doesn't have to be a world. God doesn't have to have it. but God creates it as an expression of God's love. Now, theologians like to talk in Latin. It makes us sound important. And the old classical debate was always that God creates ex nihilo, that is, out of nothing. And Norman Wordsworth, being a theologian, likes Latin as well. And he suggests that we think of it as not ex nihilo, out of nothing, but ex amore. God creates out of love. Everything that we know and experience that is a gift from God is God acting to express God's love, God's delight, and God's desire. The world is a garden created by a loving being to express that loving nature. Well, this raises, I think, an interesting theological thought for us. And maybe if we think a little more clearly here, we will have a stronger grasp on both our Christian faith and a stronger understanding for how to stand firm in our moments of difficulty and of struggle. There is a qualitative difference between a creator and the creature that the Creator makes. And maybe we get into trouble in our own thinking about our experience because we tend to forget that. Now, we have all been taught to think of God's love by imagining the person we know that loves the most. Maybe you think of Mother Teresa, or maybe you think of your grandparents as the human being who loved you in the most effective and the most powerful of ways. Now, take that experience and put it on steroids. Make it more. And that's how one can conceive of the loving nature of God. We do the same thing with other attributes. When we think of God's power, we imagine the most powerful person that we know. And we say that God's power is like that, but more. And that's a useful exercise, and that can help us to spark our imaginations and to grow theologically. But even as we do it, I would suggest there's a limitation as well. That there is something about the nature of God as the Creator, the one who makes us, that is beyond who we are. That the being of God is in some ways very different than the being of all of the creatures that God has made. Now, often we get in difficulty when we begin to consider sort of the contradictions between God's love and God's power, particularly when we have painful experiences in life, and we seem to see those two powers almost in conflict with one another. How can a good God and a loving God allow the experiences that are difficult and painful? And that's an important question. But perhaps another way to approach that is to remember that the being of God is more complicated than what it means to be human. And that the inconsistencies that overflow in our experience can find resolution in a being that is greater than us. Am I getting too heady? I hope you find that helpful. I know as I read those words, my mind was sparked, and I thought many, many good thoughts. One of the things I appreciated most about reading this book is I got an insight into another part of the country that I've only driven through a couple of times. Now, Norman Wordsba is at Duke Divinity School, and he spends an awful lot of time in western North Carolina. And in the part of writing his book, he gives away some of the history of the area where he has lived and worked for so long. And I learned about something that I found quite exciting. There was a movement back in the 1920s. A Presbyterian minister who was from Chicago moved down to western North Carolina, and he began to do some community organizing. He sparked the beginning of a farmers' cooperative so that all the farmers in that region could work together to help get fairer prices for the crops that they grew, and help to organize the farmers to have a greater participation in the market economy and not simply to be the victims of those who set prices. And then as the Depression came along, that cooperative began a new movement. They entitled it the Lord's Acre. And as a part of that movement, they asked every farmer in western North Carolina to commit to growing an extra acre of food on their farm, and that the food grown on that extra acre would be dedicated for the care of the poor, for those who were most vulnerable in the time of depression. And I understand that it was widely successful, that many, many people did it. And that became a way in which the people of that region got through the Great Depression. And after the Depression was over, there was one group that maintained the Lord's Acre, just in a little different way. It was actually only 3/4 of an acre, but, And they committed to nurturing this garden year after year. And all of the produce that came from the garden would go directly to food pantries and to soup kitchens. Long after there were no more family farms around, there was still this Lord's 3/4 of an acre carrying on that vision. They had an experience one day. They noticed that some of the food that they had grown was disappearing. Had a whole lot of watermelons that had grown, and they were going to donate them, and they were gone. Well, they did a little research, and bit by bit they found out that one of the volunteers who was coming was going home with a little more than they were entitled to. Now, you would understand if they got very angry with her and kicked her out of the Lord's Acre, but they did none of that. Once they figured out who it was and what they were doing, they went and they had a long conversation with the individual, explaining again and again the purpose of the work that they were doing, that yes, she was entitled to some assistance from it, but that she could not take everything that she wanted. And they had that conversation in her home. And while they were there, they noticed that on her property there was plenty of land. And that very same group that had gone to talk with her about the inappropriateness of her behavior worked with her month after month and year after year to learn how to plant her own garden, how to grow the food that she would need for herself. She began to develop the skills to care for herself, even as she helps to care for others. You see, if the world is a garden, we behave accordingly. If we understand that the very fundamental nature of life is not a supermarket, but a garden, we will live very differently. The other illustration that Norman used in that chapter that I found very helpful was a description of a recent movie entitled Babette's Feast. Have any of you seen it? That's 3 more people than saw it at the 9 o'clock service. And I'm really, really glad that Norman recapped the picture for me, because the version I saw was I think it was in German, and it had subtitles. And Ken can read German. Ken can speak German, so. What's that? Danish. Forgive me. But the story of Babette's Feast is fascinating. There's a civil war that goes on in Paris, and Babette is on the losing side. So Babette has to leave the city of Paris, but before she goes, this is how we know Babette is not a Methodist. Before she leaves Paris, she enters a lottery. Then she makes her way to this very, very small Norwegian town that was founded by a very, very committed and loyal Christian who was also just a little on what's the word I'm looking for? Very dour, believing that the good things of the world would distract the faithful from the good things of God. So they lived a very simple life, dressed in very, very plain clothing, did not spend a great deal of time affirming and building one another up in faith. Just not very expressive. So Babette shows up at this village. She has nowhere to go. She's looking for a job, but no one has money to pay her. And finally, one family takes her in and says, yes, you can stay with us, but we cannot pay you. And if you would be willing to cook, that would be great. However, we only eat salted cod and brown and ale bread soup. I have no idea what ale bread soup is, but that's what they had every day. Every day. every day. And while Babette is in this village, they decide that they really should observe the 100th anniversary of the person who founded the community. And while they were making their very simple plans, Babette finds out that the lottery ticket she bought in Paris before she left won. So she gets 10,000 francs, I believe it is. And she's really very, very grateful for the hospitality of this community. And so she decides that she'd like to use some, if not all of that money, to prepare a great feast. Well, these dour Christians were just a tad bit concerned. They did not want to be rude to Babette. So they agreed that she could throw the feast. So she went back to France to collect her winnings and to get the fixings for this wonderful feast. And while she was gone, they all agreed that they would go to the feast, they would eat the food, but they would not talk about it. They would consume it as if it were salted cod and ale bread soup. And when the day of the feast comes, a longtime member who had been a part of the community years ago, who knew the founder and knew him well, returned and was a part of the celebration. But he was not part of the compact where they had decided not to compliment the food. He'd also been around to many, many places, and as he sat at the feast, he knew that the wine they were drinking was among the finest available, that the foods that had been prepared were some of the most, the delicacies from Europe. And he broke ranks. He praised the food. He said that it was good, that he loved it, that he savored it and expressed himself. And a funny thing happened, that when he did that, other people did it as well. And not only did they praise the food, but they began to not just honor the memory of the founder of their community, but they began to celebrate his qualities, his virtues. And not only did they celebrate his, but they began to look at one another and appreciate the gifts and the graces and the goodness in their neighbor. You see, it doesn't make any sense to love the good and creating God without loving the good creation that God has made. We are not passing through a discount department store, and we can do more than simply grab for ourselves. We have been placed in a garden that will provide for us and give us opportunities that we might give back, that others might be provided for as well. Love. Love is the very foundation of all that we have been given. Amen. And now may the grace of the God who made you and who made us all, may the power and the presence of Jesus Christ, and may the sustaining influence of God's Spirit be with you this day and all your days. Amen.